Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Welcome, everyone. Today is November 18th, 2025, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. Today's episode is about prison reform and features human rights defender Lalee Awad and psychological scientist Kate Richmond. Abdi, Lalee Awad, is an advocate with many hats. He's consulted on and facilitated culturally responsive restorative practices, co-authoring and consulting on restorative justice-based policies. His previous work includes being a senior justice scholar with Opportunity Scholars, as an advocate for access to higher education and employment of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. He's also been a 2023 UCLA Dream Fellow and an Alliance for Higher Education 2024 to 2025 Fellow. He has experience as a consultant, as a program development guide, as a restorative justice practices co-facilitator, and a mentor for the D. Clark Justice Fellowship Program, which is part of the Place Matters team under the University of Southern Maine's Catherine Cutler Institute. He approaches his work through the lenses of intersectionality and systems thinking. Lalee holds a master's degree in adult and higher education from the University of Southern Maine, where he is currently a PhD student in their leadership program. He is someone who is directly impacted by the legal system, presently incarcerated, and refuses to let his systems and circumstances define him. He is a certified hospice and palliative care volunteer and has completed 500 hours of yoga teacher training. As an advocate, Lalee draws on his experiences as an immigrant from Somalia and someone impacted by the justice system to drive change. Welcome, Lalee.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then we have Kate Richmond, who is a professor of psychology at Muhlenberg College. She's widely published in the areas of multicultural psychology, gender ideology, masculinity, and trauma. Her co-authored undergraduate textbook, entitled Psychology of Women and Gender, was awarded the 2020 Distinguished Publication Award by the Association of Women in Psychology. Dr. Richmond has been nationally recognized on several occasions for excellence in teaching, facilitation, and mentorship, including being the recipient of the Florence, Denmark Distinguished Mentoring Award and the Paul C. Empey Memorial Award for excellence in teaching. She's passionate about community-based organizing and most recently has worked within the Lehigh County Corrections Facility and is a former member of the SCI Greaterford Prison Think Tank. Dr. Richmond works alongside individuals who are currently or formerly incarcerated to increase access to higher education, reduce mass incarceration, and build healthy communities. Dr. Richmond is also a licensed psychologist and maintains a private practice in Philadelphia. Finally, she's a consultant for Khalil Jamieson Consulting Group, a firm that specializes in organizational culture change. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you.
As always, we start with our human rights defender, Lalee. Can you tell us a little bit about what prison reform means to you?
That's a great question. For me, prison reform means having developing a new definition of what prison is and what it serves, right? We have this idea that we come to it when we think about justice, right? Like when somebody's harmed, we run to the prison. We think the answer to restoring harm, not only in the person who has been harmed, but also the person who caused the harm, right? That prison is the answer. So reforming for me, it takes so many different levels. One is reforming the idea itself, right? That when we think about that justice, we don't automatically go through this idea of justice means prison. I'm sure Kate will touch on her background. Hurt people, right? Harm people, right? So even those individuals who cause harm, right? They coming from a place of hurt, right? And understanding that in not only in the court system, but also understanding that in the public eye, right? So it's easy to condemn when somebody has caused the harm. It's easy to say, oh, he or she or they, the bad people who caused this, right? So reforming covers one side of that, and it's the reframing what justice means for us. Also, it's like the practical aspect of it in the core systems, like what kind of conditions we have in prisons, what kind of citizens who has been incarcerated are we preparing for them to return to the public, right? And statistics says that 95% of the people who has been incarcerated will re-enter society, right? What we do matters while they're incarcerated, and that's where reform comes in, whether that's through education, employment, mental health support, wellness in so many different levels. Reform goes broad.
I think if I could respond to what you're saying, it's funny because that is my definition of abolitionist. So it is interesting. I think when most people think of abolitionists, they rightly acknowledge the desire and need to close prisons. And I stand strongly in that position. However, I think what, scholars who've been in this field for years have suggested that as an abolitionist, part of your responsibility is to build and envision something new. What you're saying, Lalee, is right on. It's spot on that it is a generous read that you're saying it's easy to think of prison as the answer to harm in our communities. I think it's generous because I take a position where I think people do it because they are trying to avert responsibility for some of the ways in which all of us contribute to the harms in our community. And so it's a distancing strategy. It's a way to avoid or ignore harm in our community. I think what the abolitionist in me calls people to do is to elevate the urgency, is to say, okay, these buildings that we are quite literally putting human beings in cages. I think we need to start there for hours on end. For some people, that means not having connection with any other human interaction for days on end when you're placed in, they call it sort of disciplinary segregation, which is a very fancy way of saying solitary confinement. We know as psychologists what that does to people's brains. We know that it reduces cognitive capacity, that it reduces the ability to do things like control your emotions and have affect regulation. So we know that this is not a good practice for human beings. And yet, most Americans will never walk into a prison and see this, will only envision it through movies, and will never really have to sit with the fact that that's what we do as a country. And as long as we allow that to happen, we will not take any responsibility or ownership. And so to me, why I'm an abolitionist, why I'm so passionate about it, is because I think it forces people to have to reckon with what I think we expect our jails to do, which is to deal with poverty, racism, sexism, violence, and mental health. Because the vast majority, after we closed many of our state-funded mental health institutions, most of those people who went to the streets ended up in incarceration situations. So, we have jails filled with people who are in serious need of mental health attention, but cannot get it because they are being punished.
And if I may add one more isolation that exists in geographical, like when it comes to the prisons, if you look at all the prisons, majority of people that are incarcerated is hundreds of miles away from their loved ones, right? There's a purpose why the prisons are built in outside of the distance, right? So it's like this. I believe in the federal guidelines that they have to put you minimum of like 500 miles you near as your family ones, but that does not usually happen. And if you look at majority of the prisons is not, if not all prisons, they are outside of the population areas where those who are incarcerated are from, which is creates an additional isolation that Kate touched on, which means if you already came from a poor neighborhood, poor community, and you don't have the money and all of these happening, right? What that your family have to choose whether they feed the family members that are at the house or whether they spend that money to come see you, spend on gas money, visitation, card, all of those. So there's another level of isolation that also exists in the geographical, and that what Kate touched on, that almost like hidden away. Let's hid this shame from us. Let's hid this shame from the public and isolate it and put it over there so they don't have to think about it. They don't have to see it.
Lalee, you're bringing up an important point too, which is prison does not solely harm the people who are incarcerated. It harms everyone that's connected with them, their children, their families, their spouses, and ultimately it harms whole communities. Because if you have large portions of your neighborhood, I was explaining this earlier to Lalee, that in the city of Allentown, there are 15 blocks in our city where the vast majority of people who are in the jail come from those streets, those blocks. So it's concentrated. Those blocks are over policed. As you might imagine, those blocks are predominantly people of color. These are blocks where they are either folks are underworking or unemployed. And so these are systems problems that just get exacerbated when you pull heads of houses out of their homes and streets and blocks and put them in a situation where they're quite literally being caged with almost no resources to improve their situation until they return as a returning citizen. And I'm sure Lalee can tee up all of the challenges associated with reentry, because once your system's associated or system's impacted, that stays with you your whole life.
So what I'm hearing is, in terms of the difference between prison reform and prison abolition, prison reform is the idea that prison as we know it can be improved. We can get people closer to their families. We can have people engage in meaningful work. And prison abolition is, prison as we know it is harmful by definition, and we need a new answer. Does that sound right?
Yes.
I think that is
And I'll let
accurate.
Kate touch on that too.
I think, it is important to understand that prison, as we know it, stem from the American history of slavery. So I think when people think of prison, they associate it incorrectly with justice. But I certainly could argue that justice is not occurring if the vast majority of people who end up in prison are of color, with significant or serious mental health concerns, and or under the poverty line. Like, it is a system in which if you have resources and money, you are not spending long periods of time in jail. And that is not a just system. So in some ways, our prisons are doing exactly what they were intended to do, which is to remove people of color from their families in order to segregate the communities in which we're living in. And I know that sounds harsh, but if you have spent any time in prison, there's no way you cannot quite literally see that. It doesn't make sense that we would want to fund or encourage a system that would do that to our communities. So to me, there's no capacity to reform it because it was built on a structure that was meant to harm and segregate certain communities in our country.
So, Kate, you've talked a little bit about how people outside the prison system don't have really a good concept of what it's like to be inside. Their exposure is from media and, pundits. How do we help people who are not impacted to understand what the prison system is really like?
Lalee, you want to start with that one?
To make people understand what prison is like, I would say don't look farther, right? Look at your neighbor, because the impact of incarceration is so broad in America. We have like 2.3 million people incarcerated and more who have been incarcerated in the system. And for me, I think it's people to understand, don't speak on something unless we know exactly what it is. Meet the person, right? Like, how many times I heard, oh, you're incarcerated, right? I've been because the access that I have, which not a lot of prisoners in the country have, to even be part of this, for example, right? And this perception that you have a person, I think it's seen the humanity, right? Right. So everybody that incarcerated is somebody's father, somebody's brother, somebody's son, right? Somebody's grandfather, grandmother, sister, mother, right? So seeing that humanity first, before, and it comes back to that point that we have this shame, which is rightfully is, right? The same shameful thought about prison, right? The people in prison are not the shame, right? It's the concept and the practices that are shame to our society. Everyone, you would not know somebody has been into prison. The person who's serving you at your coffee shop, the person who teaching maybe your in your college classes, every aspect of you are. So you got to see that person rather than rather than having attaching the shame of prison to the person and of clouding their humanity as who they are as father, sister, uncle. All of those things that we all choose in society.
Yeah, I think this is where psychology can also offer us some insights. I think, social psychologists remind us that when we develop relationships with people in context where when those relationships are sustained over time, there's an increase of interest. The stakes get higher when you care. I don't think it's realistic that we can get people to change their perception through research, through statistics alone. I don't think that moves people. I think what we have to do is create opportunities in which there is increased engagement across groups of difference. And that's the work that's really hard. And I'm sure Lalee can relate to this. If you're doing prison work, truly doing it well and doing research well, both Lalee and I are involved in what's called participatory action research, in which everyone who's part of the process of asking questions, collecting data, writing that data up, and communicating that research are all part of members of the community that is impacted or involved. So in order to do that research well or to do prison work well, you have to coalition build. And that means sitting across from people that you might not really agree with. For example, I don't often agree with the deputy warden. I don't often agree with the corrections officers, but they need to be part of that process because you know what? They're on the front line and they have more influence on the day-to-day of the folks who are incarcerated than I do. So understanding their perspective, their worldview is equally as important as me understanding the guys who are incarcerated. My own approach to this tends to be much more progressive. The guys in the jail have taught me that they're much more conservative in their ideas about how they want to see things move. And, that's a hard lesson for me. I have to swallow my pride sometimes and really listen to build the type of community that will create perceptual change. And that takes, I say, decades, right, to be able to facilitate the type of community that would truly be able to address some of the harms that are happening in the jail. Otherwise, you're just, cherry picking like the really easy, low-hanging fruit. You're not actually doing change. And that takes long, sustained motivation. And so, yeah, that's how you change hearts and minds around this is you show up and you start listening and getting to know people, and then you start figuring out what they care about.
I will add that to working with people, right? Like, especially someone like myself who incarcerated, it's easy to feel being other, right? So I have to fight against othering others. So whether that is the deputy wardens or the wardens or the correctional officers I work with, because that you have to like it's as a human rights defender or like I have to or who see humanity on everyone, I have to fight daily not to other them, right? So that what Kate touching us to with, and also when it comes to working with how to see, coming back to that original question, is when you're working with people that are incarcerated, don't speak for them, speak with them. So it's easy for people to get excited and say, "Oh, I did this and I did that, and I'm accomplishing this for so and so." And no, we are more than something that you can speak for. We are people that can stand next to you and speak with you, right? And those also change. It's another way of changing the heart of the mind to see the people. I'm not making the forefront someone who's incarcerated, but the ideas coming from that person who is incarcerated. See the ideas equally as someone who's on the outside, right? So don't be like, oh, this person said this because he was justice impacted. No, he said it because that person is a human. He said it because she's a human, or he's a human, or they're human. Seeing that is how you change the heart of the mind people.
So, Lalee, you've talked a little bit about what life looks like for you as an advocate and activist working towards prison reform and some of the challenges that you face, right? Tell us a little bit more about what your day-to-day work is like.
I think the first step is for me, I have to remember my humanity, right? I have to remember the humanity of me and the humanity of those around me, right? So I have to settle, understand that first until I don't, before anyone else, whether that's the public or prison staff, to see me as a human, I have to see that for myself, right? So someone doing from the inside, it's hard to forget that. It's hard to sometimes to get overwhelmed what is happening all around you, what been saying to you, what would be said about your work, and you have to become a really diplomat. And when I say diplomat, I also want to emphasize that a mindful, a kind, a diplomat, and understanding other people's a position of what do you want to do, right? Like, okay, I had this prison administration that when I was doing the prison work, um, will say no to me. And I'd be like, okay, I know you say no to me now, but just know that I'm gonna come back. And hopefully when I come back, it's yes. And we played this, like this conversation on like, okay, you say no to me, I'm gonna come back to this. So what that told me is that for me, my first step, I was saying earlier, I didn't lose the humanity of that person who say no to me. Just because you know to me doesn't mean my mission of the work I'm doing is no, right? I just got to figure out a way to win you over. And I also want to emphasize when I say win you over, it's easy when you're incarcerated to be labeled also. Another label that I hate is that manipulators, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes,
when
Lalee. I
when
hear
people
that
come
every
in,
day.
yeah. Be careful. They're going to manipulate you. So
Mhm.
you also have to navigate that. How you're not going to come off as a manipulator, but like a sound person. I see myself as a leader, right? So when I come talk to you as a leader, right, I'm speaking to you as a person who are passionate about something. So, and this conversation, and I also have to practice honesty and integrity. But it's easy to write me off. The hardest part is how do I overcome not being seen as a manipulator when you're doing the work, and how you can say, hey, this is me. I wake, sleep. This is my life. I don't have to read about it. I don't have to think about it because it's with me every day, right? So that is the way of navigating is that I love the word with, like being with it. Whether that is the process itself, be with the process, be with the people, speak with the people, and yes.
Yeah, I think I can definitely relate to the manipulator. I honestly probably could win the lottery for the amount of times I've heard that word in my time with the prison. Like it's just constant. It's always there. I think the thing about doing prison work too is that it's kind of a paradox in some ways. You have to be in a space that is known. I mean, there's signals and markers all throughout the prison that this is a dangerous, unproductive, sterile space, right? And you have to create an energy in that space that is intellectual, that is creative, that is filled with community and care. You have to create humanity, basically, in a space that is inhumane. And I'm working on a paper right now where we're talking about when you bring those two things together, the potential can be explosive. So there is a theory on liminality and liminal spaces, which also kind of invites a rite of passage where you are letting go of what you know because you're in a space that questions all of that. And so research in prison actually has the potential to be really explosive and creative if the right people are in the space to do the work. So when Lalee talks about you have to prioritize the humanity, I am in complete agreement with that. I think what drives successful research and successful programming in prisons are people that do that. And that takes a lot of time and intentionality. That means building relationships. That means prioritizing the process sometimes over the content you're producing. It means intentionally working to develop community through shared values and a shared vision. And there's a researcher that I love, Dahlia Mosley, who writes about radical hope. And radical hope is a very powerful concept to me. It's the idea of instilling hope in hopeless places. And she really believes that the way you do that is through community. You can do it in solidarity with other people, but you can't do it on your own in solitude. And she talks about critical consciousness as being a piece of that. That what researchers and educators and folks who have that book knowledge can do is offer language to understand the systems they're in. And it is really powerful when you compare that book knowledge with that lived experience and you prioritize both equally, that one is not more important than the other, but that together they could really help to drive answers to some of these questions about like, what do we do? We know the system's harmful, but what do we do different? And once you can do that at a local level, you can really start to envision something different.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about hope and successes. We've mentioned that people have a lot of stereotypes of prisoners as manipulators, that they're dangerous, right? Let's talk about the explosive potential of doing prison reform work from a lived experience perspective, from a research perspective. Tell us about some of the initiatives or advances you've seen.
I separate my work to three categories: knowledge, experience, and wisdom, right? So knowledge is what researchers like professors and people in the field like Kate write about and I learn about, right? Like from the mental health, psychology, those things. And experience for me is my life, like what I go through, what I see, what I witness. And the wisdom is what I get out of both when I combine knowledge and experience, right? So what I got at them too is that's my wisdom. And that wisdom is what drives me to do the reform and not lose a hope, right? And show and keep showing the people, like showing the society there's an other part of every one of us, there's another part of it, right? But nobody ever forgets when somebody sees a nurse, when somebody sees a teacher, when somebody sees a professor, or even ambulance driver, right? So I'm gonna use those examples. The emotion that comes, oh, they care, right? So they do this work, right? So it's almost like can I translate that kind of care that you have these fellow citizens to work, to what I'm saying, to the hope and things like that. And you question yourself a lot, especially in this work, right? One, am I doing the right thing? Am I being myself? Am I getting burned out? Is this enough? Is the people I'm working with is with me or things, all of these you constantly question yourself, which is good because if you're not questioning yourself, then you need to start questioning yourself, right? So I remember there was a point I was like, hope is the fakest dream, right? I used to say it. I don't say I don't want to have hope because hope is just a hope, right? But then until you understand what hope means, and you don't, and most of the time, at least for me, I didn't see hope in me until others saw that, right? Right. So until that interacting with the public that never met, that I never had a conversation with people I interact with to this day, when they saw that in me and they start describing the work I'm doing or my interactions with them in that kind of context, I'm like, oh, okay. So my way of hope is switched. So hope is what I think drives me, not only my work, but my day to day. Like even one of my favorite, shouldn't be saying fighters talk about it in prison. They might think it's a fighting, but it's not. I love Khabib. It's a Russian UFC fighter, right? And one of the things he said, I was listening to a small podcast he did. He said that it's sometimes the best thing. I'm a paraphrasing it, not a quote. He said that something, even when you know you don't want to do it, getting up and doing it is discipline, right? But for me, I'll take the word discipline out and I add a hope. Like even when I don't want to do it, even when I feel burned out, even when I'm tired, even when I'm tired of people around me, people telling me what to do, even when I'm around on my own doing, it's the like, and I don't want to do anything, like getting up and saying that this has to be done. that is my hope that drives.
Lalee, I think it's so powerful that you said that you didn't have hope until others mirrored that for you. And I think that's another example of how the collective is so necessary in this work. Because, any one of us, certainly, I'm sure, Lalee, you have plenty of examples where you are in the middle of doing something, trying to mobilize a particular uh, research agenda or a change that you're trying to facilitate in the jail, and it's just not working, and it's the 100th no, and you cry and you get rageful, you get angry. It's a visceral experience, and you can't always carry that hope alone, but you can tap out and then trust that your community is tapping in. So I think that's another reason why it's so necessary that hope gets incubated in a community, not necessarily just in an individual. And I think the thing about the prison work that requires hope so much is that it is a perpetual machine. You try to address one component of it, and then seven others reveal their ugly head. You're not just talking about mental health, you're talking about housing, poverty, job preparedness, childcare, legacies of trauma and abuse and violence. So, there's just all of these components that exist in any one person's life in a jail that it's just, you need a community of people who have eyes on each of those components to be able to really do holistic change. I think the thing that really is powerful about bringing together that like book knowledge with the experience in a space like a prison is that psychologists who study how change occurs in education say that those moments of critical consciousness, when you bring book knowledge with experience together in a group among people who care about a particular issue, that's where transformation happens. That's where we see the big picture change. And that's where we all feel like we can act, which is ultimately the goal, right? It's not just to think and to write a good paper. The goal is to change our communities. The goal is to walk out and be in a community where gun violence is reduced, where we have better answers to conflict and conflict resolution, where everyone is able to have meaningful jobs that affirm dignity, And so that's like ultimately what I think a college class should do. Look, I love critical thinking. I love a good paper. I love sentence structure any day. I will nerd out on that. But at the end of the day, if people in my community are starving or don't have housing, half the students that graduated from my program live in an encampment tents during the winter in Pennsylvania. Like knowing that I'm sitting in an office with light and heat where I know people I care about are in a tent in a country that is wealthy as the United States, like something's got to change. And if our colleges and universities aren't targeting those questions and answers, then we're doing something wrong.
Also, that the impact knowledge has on people for entering the prison, right? And I 100% agree with Kate that how I write a sentence should not matter if, when I leave here, I don't know where my next meal coming from, right? It should not be matter, right? And I just want to throw statistics out there for the people that are listening, right? That I think the percentage of return to prison post-release is like 3 to 5 years, like 68% chances, right? However, if you get an associate degree, that drops to 14%. If you get a bachelor's degree, that drops to 6%. And if you earn your master's, that rate dropped to 0%. Now there's a small population that I think even go in higher educations. So that knowledge itself, right? And also I also want to be mindful of like even though I say this great, amazing thing that colleges and institutions kind of offer, right? But they also have a responsibility. The schools have responsibility, right? Like, and one of the things I always want to encourage about schools is that stop othering your students, right? Like what I mean by this is that your incarcerated students should have the same exact right, even though all these statistics I throw it out there, an institution might run away with it and say, I'm part of the, education prison system, I'm doing this. But it's, as Kate was saying, what would that do if my student live in a tent? If you're not offering your students positive reforms, if you're not offering your student internships at your schools, right? If you're not offering them fellowships at your schools, if you're not offering them those things that combat the community they came from, that will get them ready post-release. That's the thing about statistics, and even like we say, sometimes we throw it out there and we don't get into the bottom line. We don't get into the source, the backbone of the problem that keep happening, and giving the lifeline to the prison system and harm over and over and over again.
So one thing too that's been really interesting in the research we've done is that we run a program where we take college students to the jail to take a course alongside students who are incarcerated. And what we have found in our research is that the students who are at the college say that they have never felt more human or seen or transformed as they do when they're in the jail, which sounds odd that you would need to take students who are in a very privileged situation, being on a university college campus, and they're feeling dehumanized by the system. And I think in our research, what we found was that college and university for some undergraduate students has now felt transactional. It has felt like credentializing, and the capacity to feel human is depleted in some of our institutions, including those of higher ed. And that's why I feel so passionately about doing work in a space like a jail and a prison, because not only does it transform the folks who are in the jail, it transforms the people who are coming into the jail through this process of removing the day-to-day, like it's almost as if we're sort of operating like robots. We just go through our days, we don't interact with people or who are different from us. And when we're asked to do that in a sustained way, we are reminded of our humanity. And so I do think there is tremendous potential about doing education and research across different groups within the prison that is connected to people, not on behalf of them, not for them, but through dialogue, through participatory action research, through community and coalition building. I mean, to be honest, that's how you build a democracy. That's how you build community, is that. And that's what our colleges and universities should be doing, and it's not. So, it's kind of ironic that I would find hope in a space that feels so hopeless, but that there's power there.
I'll just add that in addition to the power that comes from working across difference, bridging the work world and the world of justice impacted people has untapped potential, because people who are justice impacted have brilliance, they have experience to contribute. In some cases, they have, time and energy to contribute. Lalee actually is part of the Mindbridge team. He's a circle facilitator for Mindbridge, and the light of our organization would be greatly diminished without him. And part of the work that he's doing right now is to help develop critical consciousness through community circles and heal racial trauma among people in Maine. If we couldn't have tapped his talent, I can't imagine us doing work nearly as successfully as we do.
I must also add that now I'm speaking this way because I'm an employee, but the process of getting onboarding with Mindbridge, I believe I'm the first incarcerated employee working at the Mindbridge, right? Like the process of the setup, like for example, when I got the offer to join the team, I have to get clearance from the prison. I have to go through the victim advocacy groups. I have to go through the prison administrations. I have to give, description of my jobs. I have to go like so many levels getting approval. And through all of that when I share with those, and I didn't even have to explain it in so many detail. The first email I got when I got the offer was, we also want to be mindful of your process, how you're going to get us on board. So please take your time and make sure that even when you're talking to administrations, that you bill us, because that's Mindbridge work, right? So for me, I was taken back by it of like, oh wow, this is what I want to be, right? This kid, and I think sometimes what that tells me is that you don't have to be involved directly in the prison system to see somebody's humanity. You just have to be human to see human. So you just have to see that person and their circumstances for what they're going through or where they are, and doing that. You don't have to be this expert coming back to the question earlier, how do you change the mind of people? I think it's changing the heart, changing the heart. I don't think the mind changes. I think it's changing the hearts of the people and seeing that you don't have to be in certain field to see someone as a human. I don't have to be a nurse or firefighter to know what they go through when they do the work they do, right? But seeing that like you don't have to be in the field, right, to see somebody for who they are outside of their circumstances. Approach from the human perspective, see them as who they are, and then that's it. Everything will be through the process that we trust.
So before I jumped on this podcast, I was meeting with our research team, and three of our research assistants are formerly incarcerated, and they were completely shocked that Lalee has access to internet and that Lalee could be hired in a job situation, because Maine is very unique in their capacity to offer college correspondence courses and internet access and jobs. In Pennsylvania, there is no internet access in the jail, period. And there is no one can work. You can't work. You can work in the jail. You cannot work outside of the jail. If you can imagine, you are incarcerated and maybe you had a job, you have to quit that job for the time you spend in jail. So, I mean, this guys were telling me, like, I can't believe he can talk to you on the internet. So it just kind of speaks to the fact that jails are very influenced by the local politics, and they are not all the same. So when you're talking about prisons, they're different than jails, and the jails are county focused, not state. So, even this like brilliance is facilitated by a state and that allows this to occur. So like it just again speaks to how we have to be mindful of the systems. This is incredible because Maine is progressive.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to Lalee's point about how we're more similar than different. The systems from state to state are different. Prison is different from jail, but the people inside and outside are the same. And if I would be interested in meaningful work, people who are incarcerated will be interested in meaningful work. If I want the ability to practice my faith, people who are incarcerated want the ability to practice their faith. So
Yes.
I think we've learned a lot today. I want to give each of you the chance for a last word, but I'm really humbled by the conversation and want to thank you.
Lalee, I'll
Go
give
ahead,
you the
Kate.
last word. So I can just say that I think if there's anything I would like to share with folks who are listening and care about these issues is, I don't think you have to be someone who shows up at a jail to do prison reform or jail abolitionist work. I think it starts with being the person who will challenge people around this concept of jail being the only solution to harm and violence in our community. I think if I could encourage people to imagine what a world might look like where we don't simply use jail as the response to harm. And this is a hard question. This is not an easy question. But I think if you begin to entertain that question, really be thoughtful about it, you are doing the work of prison reform and prison abolitionist.
Yes, I second 100 times everything Kate said. I'm going to keep coming back to seeing that, not losing that human connection. And I will close this by a book I read in my philosophy class. In Tibet, there was a monk that has been incarcerated by the government, and he was incarcerated and he was brutally incarcerated in prison. He went through so many things, torture, lack of food, all of those. And then he was released. He went to his either Dalai Lama or he spoke to the other monks there. They were like, what was the hardest part? You being in prison, right? What was the hardest part? And response was the hardest part was losing humanity, kindness for those who oppressed me. He was worried, even though he was being oppressed, that he would lose his kindness and humanity for those who are oppressing him. That's what he said that was the hardest part. From that, I just like those who are listening, who's thinking about it, want to do the prison work or even thought about it. It's like, I'll ask you, don't lose humanity of me because I'll be your neighbor one day. And there's hundreds of thousands or more will be your neighbors one day. And I also want to say that I want to give thanks to, I don't have to name you, you know who everyone are. That has contributed to me what I am today. I also want to say thank you. And we should learn from each other. been a pleasure to be here today and have this conversation with you, Kate.
Same, Lalee. I've really enjoyed getting to know you. And also, there is this cool phenomenon where you realize there's enough of us out here doing this work. One day it's going to come together. And I do believe that.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.